Did you know that some societies once paraded unmarried women through town, all because of a hat? Could a special day, occurring only once every 4 years, truly empower women to propose marriage, or was it a charming myth with surprising rules? Were single men in history actually forced to pay a tax just for not having a spouse? And imagine trying to divine your future love life using everything from pins to pieces of cake. Did these rituals offer genuine hope or just a way to pass an anxious evening? Get ready to explore some truly unusual ways people in the past acknowledged, celebrated, or sometimes deeply worried about the state of being single. Number 7. The bachelor tax and its unsettling price tag. Imagine a world where your single status came with an actual bill from the government. This was not a flight of fancy, but a reality in various places and times, a concept known as the bachelor tax. Core idea was straightforward. Unmarried men, especially those considered of marriageable age and means, were required to pay an extra levy to the state. The motivations behind such taxes were often a mix of social engineering and fiscal need. One of the earliest known instances dates back to ancient Rome. In 9 Common Era, Emperor Augustus introduced the Lex Papia Poppaea. This law was part of a broader package of moral legislation aimed at encouraging marriage and procreation among the Roman upper classes, whose birth rates had apparently been falling. While not solely a tax, it included provisions that penalized the unmarried and childless. For instance, unmarried men and women between certain ages faced limitations on their ability to inherit property or receive legacies. If a man was unmarried beyond a certain age, he might only be able to inherit a portion of what was left to him, with the rest going to the state or to married relatives with children. This was less a direct tax collected annually and more a financial disincentive embedded within inheritance law. But its effect was similar. Being single could cost you. The law specified ages. For men, it was often between 25 and 60 years old, and for women, between 20 and 50. Aim was clear: to push citizens towards marriage and having children, which Augustus saw as vital for the strength and future of Rome. Historical records suggest these laws were met with some resistance and were modified over time, yet the principle endured for centuries. Fast forward many centuries, and the idea resurfaced in different forms. In England, during the reign of William III, a Marriage Duty Act, or registration tax, was passed in 1695. This act imposed taxes on births, marriages, and burials, but also included an annual tax on bachelors over the age of 25 and on childless widowers. The rates varied based on social standing. A duke who was a bachelor paid a hefty sum of £12 and 10 shillings per year, a significant amount at the time, while a common person paid just 1 shilling. The tax was intended to raise funds for the war against France, known as the 9 Years' War. It was in effect for about a decade, until 1706. Records from this period show collectors going door to door, assessing individuals for this tax. The existence of detailed rate schedules based on social hierarchy indicates how seriously this fiscal measure was implemented. For example, esquires paid £5 and 1 shilling. Gentlemen paid £1 and 1 shilling across the Atlantic. Some American colonies and later states experimented with similar ideas. In Missouri, as late as 1821, a law imposed a tax of $1 per year on all unmarried free white males between the ages of 21 and 50. This might seem like a small amount, but in the context of the time, it was not negligible for everyone. The state of Michigan in 1838 considered a bachelor tax, though it is unclear if it was fully implemented or for how long. These American instances were often justified not just for revenue, but also with the argument that bachelors having fewer dependents could afford to contribute more to the public purse, or that they were shirking a societal duty to marry and form families, considered the bedrock of the community. Even into the 20th century, the idea did not entirely vanish. After World War I, some countries grappling with population losses and economic hardship toyed with bachelor taxes. For example, Italy, under Benito Mussolini in 1927, introduced a bachelor tax as part of his demographic campaign to increase the Italian population. Men between the ages of 25 and 65 were targeted. Tax started at 70 lire and increased with age, reaching 100 lire for men between 50 and 65. Furthermore, bachelors faced professional disadvantages. They were often last in line for promotions or jobs in public administration. Preferences were explicitly given to married men, especially those with many children. Mussolini famously stated, "Let us be frank, what are 40 million Italians compared to 90 million Germans and 200 million Slavs? What are they compared to 40 million Frenchmen, plus their 90 million Englishmen, plus their 450 million colonial subjects?" His demographic battle, Battaglia Demografica, aimed for an Italian population of 60 million by 1950. The bachelor tax was a tool in this campaign. It was collected until the fall of his regime. South Africa also implemented a bachelor tax in 1919, primarily on white males, which was later extended. It faced criticism and was eventually abolished. Poland, in the post-World War II era, under communist rule, had a tax known as biko, which literally translates to bull tax, levied on childless and unmarried adults over the age of 21 or 25, depending on the period. This tax existed in various forms from 1946 until the 1970s, and its rates and conditions changed over time. The revenue was often earmarked for funds, supporting families with children. Arguments against such taxes historically pointed to individual liberty and the fairness of penalizing someone for a personal life choice. Practicalities of enforcing such a tax, verifying marital status consistently, and dealing with exemptions also posed challenges. The decline of bachelor taxes in most parts of the world by the mid to late 20th century coincided with changing social norms regarding marriage, increased emphasis on individual autonomy, and different approaches to fiscal policy and social welfare. Yet, for significant stretches of history, remaining a single man could mean an annual reminder from the tax collector about your societal obligations, or at least your perceived capacity to pay more. The amounts varied. The justifications shifted from moral rectitude to wartime funding to population growth. But the underlying message was often that singleness for men was a state that could and sometimes should be taxed. Number 6. The unmarried aunt and her unique household kingdom. The figure of the unmarried aunt, often referred to simply as auntie or by a specific given name, occupied a distinct and evolving space within family structures for many centuries, particularly from the 18th through the early 20th centuries in Western societies. This was not a formal tradition with set dates or rituals, but rather a deeply ingrained social role, a way of life shaped by circumstance, societal expectation, and individual personalities. For women who did not marry, often due to a lack of suitable partners, economic constraints, personal choice, or the loss of young men in wars, becoming an integral part of an extended family, usually a sibling's household, was a common path. These women were frequently known as spinsters, a term originally denoting a woman who spins yarn, a common occupation for unmarried women. Over time, it became synonymous with an older unmarried woman. The role of the unmarried aunt was complex, a blend of dependence and significant contribution. Numerically, in periods like the 19th century, there could be a surplus of women in certain regions or social classes, making marriage less statistically probable for all. For example, after major wars, the imbalance in sex ratios often left many women without prospects of marriage. Within the household, the unmarried aunt often took on a variety of crucial tasks. She might be the primary caregiver for her nieces and nephews, acting as a second mother. Her responsibilities could include educating the children, mending clothes, managing parts of the household, and nursing sick family members. This labor was invaluable, but frequently unpaid or compensated only with room and board. She was family, yet often without the authority or autonomy of the married heads of household. Insights from diaries and letters of the period reveal that these aunts could form incredibly strong bonds with their nieces and nephews, sometimes becoming confidant and mentor in a way that parents with their more disciplinary roles could not. Jane Austen herself, an unmarried woman who lived with her family, provides literary examples of such characters, and her own life reflected this supportive familial role. She helped raise numerous nieces and nephews, and her letters are filled with details of their lives. There was a duality to this existence. On one hand, the unmarried aunt had a defined place and purpose. She was part of a family unit, protected and involved in daily life. She could cultivate her own interests, perhaps in reading, writing, music, or charity work, to a degree that might have been difficult for a wife and mother with more direct and demanding responsibilities for her own immediate family. On the other hand, this role could also be one of marginalization. Her status was often seen as secondary to that of her married siblings. She might have little financial independence, relying on the goodwill of her brother or brother-in-law. Term, old maid, another label for unmarried women, often carried connotations of pity, sometimes even scorn or caricature, portraying such women as eccentric, bitter, or unfulfilled. Literature and social commentary of the 18th and 19th centuries are replete with these contrasting depictions. The number of women who remained unmarried varied by period and location. In England and Wales, in 1871, census data showed that about 13% of women aged 45–49 had never married. By 1901, this figure was closer to 15% for the same age group. These numbers represent a significant minority of women whose lives did not follow the then dominant pattern of marriage and childbearing. For many of them, the role of aunt became a central feature of their adult identity. The emotional landscape of the unmarried aunt could be rich and varied. Some, no doubt, felt a sense of loss or regret regarding marriage and children of their own. Others may have found contentment and fulfillment in their roles, cherishing their independence from a husband and the unique connections they forged with their extended family. The level of agency an unmarried aunt possessed often depended on her personality, her family's financial situation, and the specific dynamics of the household she lived in. Some unmarried aunts with independent means, perhaps through inheritance, could wield considerable influence and live with a greater degree of freedom. The decline of this specific social role began in the late 19th and accelerated throughout the 20th century. Several factors contributed to this shift. Increased educational and employment opportunities for women meant that remaining single did not necessarily equate to dependence. Women could pursue careers, live independently, and create their own households. The rise of new professions, like nursing, teaching, and secretarial work, often initially dominated by single women, provided alternative paths. Changes in social attitudes towards marriage and singleness also played a part. Singleness became more accepted as a legitimate life choice rather than a state of unfortunate circumstance. The ideal of the nuclear family, while still strong, saw the extended household with resident unmarried aunts become less common, particularly with increased urbanization and mobility, while aunts still exist. Of course, the specific, almost institutionalized role of the unmarried aunt as a fixture within a sibling's household, performing a defined set of duties in exchange for support, has largely faded into a historical social pattern. It was a tradition born of necessity and societal structure, one that offered both support and constraints to countless women. Number 5. Desperate measures with divination cakes and love spells. For centuries, especially when marriage was a primary determinant of a woman's social and economic standing, single individuals, particularly young women, turned to a vast array of folk rituals and divination practices in hopes of glimpsing their romantic future or even magically influencing it. These were not usually large public celebrations, but often quiet, personal, or small group traditions passed down through generations, filled with specific instructions, timings, and a potent mixture of hope and anxiety. The aim was almost always to discover the identity of a future spouse, the timing of a marriage, or simply whether marriage was in their destiny at all. One widespread category of such practices involved dumb cakes or dreaming bread. These were special cakes prepared in complete silence, often by a group of unmarried young women, typically on specific nights believed to be conducive to divination, such as Halloween, New Year's Eve, or St. Agnes's Eve on January 20th. The ingredients and methods varied by region and tradition. A common recipe might involve simple elements like flour, water, salt, and sometimes soot or other symbolic additions. Each participant would have a role in mixing, kneading, or baking the cake, all performed without uttering a single word. If anyone spoke, the spell was believed to be broken. After the cake was baked, portions were often eaten before bed or placed under the pillow. The hope was that the young woman would then dream of her future husband. Sometimes the ritual required specific actions while eating or placing the cake, such as walking backward to bed. The details were crucial. For example, one version of a dumb cake ritual involved 3 young women making a small cake of flour, water, and salt. They were to turn it 3 times each while it baked, and then divide it into 3 parts. Each woman would eat her portion and walk to bed backwards, without speaking. It was believed her future husband would appear in her dreams, or even physically manifest to turn her in bed. The silence was paramount, creating an atmosphere of suspense and magical potential. These practices were recorded in folklore collections from across the British Isles, parts of Europe, and North America from at least the 17th century onwards. Another popular form of love divination involved the use of everyday objects in prescribed ways. Apple pairings were common. A young woman would peel an apple in one continuous strip. She would then swing the paring around her head 3 times and throw it over her shoulder. The shape the paring formed on the floor was supposed to represent the initial of her future husband's name. This practice is mentioned in numerous poems and accounts of rural life from the 18th and 19th centuries. Similarly, nuts were used on Halloween, a night particularly rich in divination lore. 2 nuts would be named for the girl and her potential sweetheart and placed on the hearth or a fire grate. If the nuts burned steadily together, it signified a true and lasting love. If one or both popped or jumped away, it indicated a fickle lover or a failed romance. Robert Burns' 1785 poem Halloween describes several such divination practices common in Scotland. Mirrors also played a significant role. On Halloween, a young woman might eat an apple in front of a mirror by candlelight, hoping to see the face of her future husband appear over her shoulder in the reflection. Another mirror ritual involved walking backward down cellar stairs with a mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the fated face. These practices were often performed alone, adding to their eerie and potentially frightening nature. The darkness, the silence, the flickering candlelight all contributed to an atmosphere where the imagination could easily take flight. Pins were another tool in the diviner's kit. One ritual involved sticking 9 new pins into a specific type of apple or an onion and placing it under the pillow. Or girls might drop pins into a bowl of water with the patterns they formed or the number that crossed, supposedly indicating something about their romantic prospects. St. Agnes's Eve, January 20th, was particularly associated with love divination. Young women would fast all day and perform specific rituals before bed, such as looking up the chimney or sowing hemp seed in the churchyard at midnight, while reciting a charm, all in the hope of seeing their future husband. John Keats' famous 1820 poem, The Eve of St. Agnes, beautifully captures the romantic and superstitious atmosphere of these practices. He writes of young maidens going to bed supperless, nor look behind, nor sideways, but require of heaven with upward eyes for all that they desire. These traditions, while perhaps seeming quaint or superstitious to a modern observer, reflect a deep-seated human desire for love, security, and a glimpse into the unknown future. In societies where a woman's options were often limited without marriage, the question of who and when was of paramount importance. The number of these rituals is vast, with countless local variations. For example, in some parts of England, girls would run around a haystack 9 times with a rake, expecting to see their future husband appear on the 9th circuit. The specificity of the numbers, 3 turns, 9 pins, 12 strokes of midnight, highlights the magical thinking involved, where precision was key to success. Persistence of these practices for hundreds of years, even as skepticism grew with the Enlightenment and scientific advancements, speaks to their powerful hold on the popular imagination. They offered a sense of agency, however illusory, in a matter of great personal significance. While the making of dumb cakes, or the interpretation of apple pairings, is no longer a common activity for single women seeking partners, these lost traditions provide a fascinating insight into the hopes, fears, and everyday magic that once surrounded the journey. They were a way of mourning the uncertainty of being single while actively, if magically, trying to celebrate a future union. Number 4. The Spinsters' Rock and Other Stony Seats of Fate. Across various cultures, particularly in parts of the British Isles and Scandinavia, specific natural landmarks, often unusually shaped rocks or ancient stone seats, became imbued with folklore related to singleness, marriage, and fertility. These were not man-made traditions in the sense of organized events, but rather organic beliefs that attached themselves to physical places, passed down through generations of local storytelling. For single women, and sometimes men, these spinsters' rocks, wishing chairs, or maiden stones offered a focal point for hopes and anxieties about their marital future, acting as sites for personal, often solitary ritual. One prominent example is the Spinsters' Rock in Dursteenton, Devon, England. This is a Neolithic dolmen, a type of single-chamber megalithic tomb, consisting of 3 upright stones supporting a large capstone, estimated to weigh around 16 tons. While its original prehistoric purpose is a subject of archaeological debate, local legend transformed it into a site of romantic prophecy. One story tells that it was erected by 3 spinsters one morning before breakfast. Another, more pertinent to its later folklore, suggests that if an unmarried woman crawls through the opening between the stones a certain number of times, or sits upon it under specific conditions, she will be married within the year. The number of crawls often cited in folklore is 7 or 9 times numbers frequently associated with magic. Such sites became destinations for young women of the parish, who might visit perhaps half in jest, half in earnest, to test their luck. The physical act of engaging with the stone, crawling, sitting, touching, was believed to activate its purported powers. Similar traditions can be found elsewhere. In Cornwall, Menontoll, another ancient site with a hold stone was associated with healing rituals, but also, in some local lore, with fertility and marriage. Passing through the hole was said to cure rickets in children or back pain in adults. But for young women, it was sometimes believed to ensure a swift marriage or easy childbirth. The age of these stones, often thousands of years old, lent them an aura of ancient power and mystery, making them credible vessels for such beliefs. Archaeologists date sites like Menontoll to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 1,500 years before Common Era, yet their folkloric associations continued well into the 19th and even early 20th centuries. In Ireland, numerous wishing chairs or marriage stones exist, often associated with saints or ancient ruins. For example, at the monastic site of Clonmacnoise, there were tales of stones that, if sat upon by a young woman, would lead to her marriage. The Giant's Causeway in County Antrim has a natural rock formation known as the wishing chair. Legend holds that if a woman sits in it and makes a wish particularly for a husband, it will come true. Millions of visitors have sat in this basalt throne over the decades, many no doubt aware of the old tales. Persistence of these stories, even in a more secular age, speaks to their appeal. Scotland, too, has its share of such sites. The Maiden Stone, near Inverurie, Aberdeenshire, is a Pictish carved stone dating from around the 8th or 9th century, Common Era. While its intricate carvings likely had complex meanings for the Picts, later folklore wove romantic tales around it. One legend tells of a laird's daughter who made a pact with the devil to build a road to her lover's castle before her wedding. She was turned to stone when she failed or broke the pact. While not a direct wishing stone for marriage, it became a landmark associated with a tragic maiden, a cautionary tale perhaps, but one that kept the idea of maidenhood and its fate tied to the physical landscape. These traditions around stones were often highly localized. The specific rituals, the number of times an action had to be performed, or the particular day or time for a visit would vary from place to place. What they shared was the belief that a particular spot in the natural world held a special power over one's marital destiny. For those mourning their single state or anxiously awaiting marriage, these places offered a tangible focus for their desires. The act of visiting the stone, performing the small ritual, was a proactive step, a way of engaging with fate. The decline of these beliefs was gradual, linked to broader societal changes, increased education, the rise of scientific explanations for natural phenomena, greater mobility which detached people from deeply local traditions, and changing attitudes towards marriage itself. As marriage became less of an absolute economic or social necessity for women, the urgency behind such divinatory practices lessened. However, many of these stones remain local landmarks, and their stories are still told, often as part of local history or tourism. For instance, the Spinsters Rock in Devon is a protected ancient monument, visited for its archaeological significance, but its name and the folklore attached to it preserve the memory of a time when a cold, hard stone could seem to hold the key to a young woman's happiness and future. These traditions represent a fascinating intersection of geology, archaeology, folklore, and the enduring human preoccupation with love and partnership, reflecting a time when the path to marriage could, it was hoped, be influenced by a simple interaction with an ancient stone. The number of such sites scattered across landscapes is a testament to how deeply these beliefs were once embedded. Number 3. Skimmingtons and the cacophony against unconventional unions, or stubborn singleness. The Skimmington ride, also known as a charivari in France and other parts of Europe, or rough music in some English regions, was a boisterous and often intimidating form of community justice or social commentary, prevalent from at least the 16th century up to the 19th century. While most commonly associated with shaming individuals for marital transgressions, such as a domineering wife, a henpecked husband, adultery, or a May-December marriage, an older person marrying someone much younger, the skimmington could also, in some contexts, target those who defied conventional marriage normen, including, occasionally, prolonged or defiant singleness, or marriages seen as inappropriate for other reasons. It was essentially a tradition of public humiliation, intended to enforce community standards. The core elements of a skimmington were noise and effigies. Crowd, often disguised or with blackened faces, would parade through the village or town, typically at night. They would bang pots, pans, kettles, and any other noise-making implement they could find, creating a deafening racket known as rough music. Procession often featured effigies of the individuals being targeted, paraded on a pole or a donkey, sometimes positioned in comical or derogatory poses. For example, if a wife was accused of beating her husband, the effigy might show her holding a stick over a cowering male figure. Procession would usually stop outside the house of the accused, where the noise would intensify and derisive songs or rhymes might be chanted. Historical records and court documents from England, France, Germany, and even colonial North America detail numerous instances of skimmingtons. Thomas Hardy, in his 1886 novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, provides a vivid fictional account of a skimmity ride aimed at Lucetta and Henchard, whose past relationship became fodder for public scandal. This literary depiction draws on real historical practices. Hardy describes the grotesque figures borne aloft, the blare of rough music from marrow bones and cleavers, combs and papers, razor and mirror, tambourine, trumpets, bells, and drums. While the primary targets were often married couples behaving badly, the logic of community enforcement of norms could extend to those who stubbornly resisted marriage, or whose single status was deemed problematic. In some tight-knit rural communities, where marriage and family formation were central to social and economic order, an adult who remained single beyond a certain age, especially if perceived as flouting opportunities or community expectations, might become an object of lesser forms of mockery or pressure that shared characteristics with the skimmington. The line could be thin between general community disapproval and a more organized shaming ritual. For example, if an older, wealthy bachelor was seen as selfishly hoarding resources by not marrying and creating a family, he might become the subject of satirical verses or localized mockery. Similarly, an older spinster, particularly if she was seen as meddling or eccentric, could also face community censure, though outright skimmingtons against single individuals seem less common in records than those against marital infractions. The number of participants in a skimmington could range from a small group of youths to a significant portion of the village. The event was not officially sanctioned by law. Indeed, it was often illegal and could lead to arrests for riot or public disorder. However, local authorities sometimes turned a blind eye, especially if the targets were unpopular or if the skimmington was seen by many in the community as upholding shared values. The symbolism was potent. The effigies, the backward riding donkey, a traditional symbol of foolishness or cuckoldry, the cacophony, all were designed to inflict maximum shame and serve as a warning to others. Practice was particularly strong in rural areas and among the lower classes. E.P. Thompson, the historian, explored these rituals in his essay, Rough Music, highlighting them as a form of counter-theater by which ordinary people asserted their own moral codes. The frequency of skimmingtons varied by region and time. They seem to have been quite prevalent in 17th and 18th century England and France. For instance, court records from Essex, England in the early 17th century contain several indictments for participation in skimmingtons. The decline of the skimmington ride in the 19th century was due to several factors. Increased policing and a more formalized justice system meant that such informal community sanctions were less tolerated by authorities. Urbanization and industrialization led to more anonymous societies, where the tight-knit community controls of village life weakened. Changing social norms also played a role. What might have been considered a legitimate cause for a skimmington in 1750 was perhaps viewed differently by 1850. The rise of a more respectable working-class culture also tended to frown upon such boisterous and unruly public displays. For those who found themselves on the receiving end, a skimmington was a terrifying and deeply shaming experience. It was a stark manifestation of community disapproval, a public declaration that you had transgressed. While not exclusively aimed at the unmarried, its underlying principle was the enforcement of societal norms, and the norm was almost universally marriage. Therefore, by implication, those who existed outside this norm, even if not directly targeted by a full-blown skimmington, were subject to the cultural pressures that such traditions reinforced. It was a loud, clear, and often cruel way the community mourned what it perceived as deviations from the expected path of life, with singleness, in certain contexts, being one such deviation. The last recorded instances of full-scale skimmington-like events in England date to the late 19th or very early 20th century, though faint echoes persisted in localized youth pranks or charivaris for newlyweds for a while longer. Number 2. The Catherinettes of France, and their bittersweet yellow and green hats. On November 25th each year, a distinctive tradition once flourished in France, particularly in Paris, centered around St. Catherine of Alexandria, the patron saint of unmarried women, milliners, and students, among others. This was the Fête de Sainte Catherine, a day when unmarried women who had reached the age of 25 were specially honored, or perhaps commiserated with. These women were known as Catherinettes. Tradition involved them wearing elaborate, often homemade hats in shades of yellow and green, and participating in parades, balls, and other festivities. It was a complex blend of celebration, social commentary, and a touch of wistful hope. The choice of age 25 was significant. In earlier centuries, and certainly up to the early 20th century, a woman remaining unmarried at this age was often considered to be on the path to becoming an old maid or vieille fille. The festival, therefore, acknowledged this milestone. Tradition is believed to have roots stretching back centuries, with St. Catherine herself being a figure of the early 4th century, a martyr who refused marriage to an emperor. However, the more formalized celebration of Catherinettes, especially within the millinery and fashion houses of Paris, gained particular prominence in the late 19th and early to mid-20th centuries. The symbolism of the colors yellow and green for the Catherinettes' hats is subject to some interpretation. Yellow sometimes historically signified deceit or jealousy, but in this context it, along with green, often associated with hope or youth, seems to have been more about creating a distinctive, festive, and perhaps slightly whimsical emblem for these women. The hats themselves were often marvels of creativity adorned with flowers, ribbons, and symbols representing the Catherinette's hopes, her profession, or aspects of St. Catherine's life, like a wheel, representing the spiked wheel she was tortured on, or a sword with which she was eventually beheaded. These hats were a point of pride and a central focus of the day. On November 25th, Catherinettes would often start their day by visiting a statue of Saint Catherine, typically to coiffer Saint Catherine, meaning to adorn her statue with a new, beautifully made hat. This act was symbolic, a plea to the saint to help them find a husband, so they would not have to coiffer Saint Catherine again the following year. The saying went that they were capping Saint Catherine, hoping to soon uncap her, meaning they would marry and no longer need her direct intercession for spinsterhood. There was a poignant prayer associated with the day. Sainte Catherine, aide-moi, ne pas mourir célibataire. Unmarried, Sainte Catherine, un bon, Sainte Catherine, mais plutôt un que, pas du tout. This translates to, Saint Catherine, help me. Do not let me die single. A husband, Saint Catherine. A good one, Saint Catherine, but rather one than none at all. The day was not solely one of solemn prayer. It was also a day of considerable festivity, especially in workplaces with many young women, like Parisian fashion houses, department stores, and millinery workshops. Employers would often host parties or balls for their Catherinettes. There were parades in the streets with Catherinettes showing off their elaborate headwear. Postcards depicting Catherinettes in their festive hats were popular, and newspapers would report on the celebrations. The number of women participating in these events in cities like Paris could be quite large. For example, major couture houses like Lanvin or Chanel would have their own internal celebrations for their unmarried female employees aged 25 and over. The tradition had a dual nature. On one hand, it was a celebration of these young women, their skills, especially if they were milliners, as making their own hat was a key part of the tradition, and their camaraderie. It was a day when they were the center of attention. On the other hand, it undeniably highlighted their unmarried status at an age when many of their peers would already be wives and mothers. There was an undercurrent of societal pressure, a public acknowledgement that they had reached a certain deadline. The festivities could be seen as a cheerful yet firm reminder to find a spouse. The intensity of the Catherinette tradition began to wane significantly after World War II, and especially from the 1960s onwards. Several factors contributed to this decline. Social norms around marriage changed dramatically. Women increasingly pursued higher education and careers, and the age of first marriage rose. Being unmarried at 25 or even 30 no longer carried the same social stigma or implications of spinsterhood. The rise of feminism also led to a questioning of traditions that seemed to define women primarily by their marital status. The idea of being publicly singled out for being unmarried at 25 became less appealing to many women. However, traces of the tradition persist in some parts of France, particularly in towns with a strong connection to millinery or crafts. Smaller-scale celebrations of Saint Catherine may still occur. Some families might acknowledge it. The vivid image of young women in bright yellow and green hats, parading with a mixture of pride and perhaps a little anxiety, remains a strong cultural memory. It was a unique way of marking a specific point in a single woman's life, a tradition that simultaneously celebrated her and gently, or not so gently, mourned her continued singleness, urging her with flowers and festivities towards the altar. The number of elaborate hats produced each year for this one day was once a testament to its cultural importance in the world of French fashion and beyond. Number 1. The leap year privilege and its curious price for refusal. One of the most enduring and perhaps most romanticized lost traditions associated with singleness is the leap year custom, where women were supposedly granted the right to propose marriage to men. This tradition, typically linked to February 29th, a day that occurs only once every 4 years, 1461 days, has roots shrouded in folklore and a surprising amount of legislation-like detail, though the historical veracity of its origins is often debated. It represents a temporary inversion of traditional gender roles in courtship, a brief window where women could take the initiative in a very significant way. The most popular origin story traces the custom back to 5th century Ireland, involving Saint Bridget of Kildare and Saint Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. According to legend, Saint Bridget complained to Saint Patrick about the unfairness of women having to wait for men to propose. Saint Patrick, in a magnanimous gesture, supposedly decreed that women could propose marriage on this one day in a leap year. Some versions of the tale even have Saint Bridget herself immediately proposing to Saint Patrick, who declined but softened the blow by giving her a kiss and a silk gown. This picturesque story, however, lacks strong contemporary historical evidence from the 5th century. and is more likely a later romantic embellishment, perhaps emerging in the medieval period or even later. Another widely cited, though likely apocryphal, piece of legislation comes from Scotland. A supposed Act of Parliament, passed by Queen Margaret of Scotland in 1288, allegedly stipulated that any man who refused a marriage proposal from a woman on Leap Day would be fined. The fines mentioned vary in different accounts, ranging from a kiss to a pair of gloves, a silk dress, or even a sum of money. £1 was sometimes cited. The law, as it's often described, supposedly required the proposing woman to wear a red petticoat or some other visible scarlet garment to signal her intentions clearly. However, historians have found no record of such a law in Scottish parliamentary archives. Queen Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, was only 5 years old in 1288 and living in Norway at the time, making her authorship of such a law highly improbable. It is more likely that this story was a later invention, perhaps from the 18th or 19th century, when such quaint old laws became popular subjects. Despite the dubious origins, the tradition gained considerable traction in popular culture across the British Isles, Europe, and eventually North America, particularly from the 17th century onwards. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, the leap year proposal was a well-established humorous and sometimes serious social custom. Postcards, magazine articles, and cartoons frequently depicted comical scenes of women aggressively pursuing bewildered men on February 29th. There were leap year balls and parties where women were expected to invite men to dance and perhaps to propose. The fine for refusing a leap year proposal, often said to be a silk gown or 12 pairs of gloves, is an interesting detail. The gloves were supposedly to allow the rejected woman to hide the shame of not having an engagement ring. This aspect highlights the underlying vulnerability still associated with a woman proposing, even within this privileged context. While presented as empowering, the tradition was often framed with a layer of humor that could also trivialize the woman's agency. The number 12 for the pairs of gloves is specific and appears in many tellings. In some parts of Europe, such as Finland, the tradition was that if a man refused a leap year proposal, he was obliged to buy the woman enough fabric to make a skirt. In Denmark, the penalty was 12 pairs of gloves. In Germany, it was sometimes 3 kisses. These local variations show how the core idea adapted to different cultural contexts. The existence of these fines suggests that while the woman had the right to propose, the man still held the ultimate power of acceptance or refusal, and his refusal came with a tokenistic, almost consolatory price. The actual number of women who seriously availed themselves of this leap year privilege to propose marriage is impossible to quantify accurately. It was certainly a topic of much discussion and jest. For some, it might have provided a legitimate opportunity to express their feelings or secure a commitment from a hesitant suitor. For others, it was likely more of a light-hearted social game. The newspapers of the early 20th century often ran stories, some perhaps embellished, of women making leap year proposals, sometimes with humorous outcomes. For example, there were tales of women sending telegrams or letters of proposal on February 29th. Tradition also functioned as a way to gently mourn or acknowledge the prolonged singleness of women. If a woman was still unmarried and a leap year came around, it was seen as her chance. The humor often surrounding it could also serve to diffuse the societal pressure on women to marry. By making it a bit of a joke, the seriousness of the situation was perhaps lessened. The decline of the leap year proposal tradition as a significant social phenomenon can be attributed to the broader shifts in gender roles and courtship practices throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. As women gained more equality in other spheres of life, the idea of needing a special day to propose became anachronistic. Women became increasingly free to initiate relationships and discuss marriage on any day of the year without societal censure. While the concept of a leap year proposal still lingers in popular culture as a quaint and charming notion, often appearing in romantic comedies or light-hearted news segments every 4 years, it no longer carries the weight or the specific set of unwritten rules and penalties it once did. It remains a fascinating example of a lost tradition that offered a temporary once every minus 1461 days suspension of typical romantic protocols, a brief moment for women to celebrate their agency in seeking a partner, or perhaps to mourn the societal constraints that made such a special day feel necessary in the first place.